Tara, thanks for joining us. For those who don't know, Dr. Penney is a new assistant professor at York University. She's an assistant professor of food systems and policy evaluation at the School of Global Health. She's also an investigator with the Global Strategy Lab and a member of the Dietary Institute of Global Health Research at York. She's also a visiting researcher at the MRC Epidemiology Unit at the University of Cambridge in the UK. She's worked in the past with national and international organizations in the area of food system transition, including the Cambridge Global Food Global Food Security, which is an interdisciplinary research center at the University of Cambridge, the Global Food Security Program in London, and the WHO European Office. So we're happy to have Tara join us. She's recently rejoined us in Canada after having spent quite a bit of time, I believe, in the UK. So we're happy to have her return. I believe you're a native Canadian. Is that right? Yeah. So we got you back. That's good. And I'm excited to hear a bit about some of your past projects here, and we really appreciate you taking the time. So with that, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks, Tara.
Oh, thanks, Michael. I appreciate that. And thank you for the welcome home as well. It was, yeah, it was well timed, I think, actually, upon reflection. Yeah, I think what I can do, because I'm going to actually introduce myself a little bit as well, just in terms of my background. So I think basically I can just say that broadly speaking, I feel like this is a great group for me to have a bit of a sort of a dialogue and discussion with. It seems like everyone's interested in food and food systems, and just at a cursory glance, it sounds like quite a few of you dig into the details around the supply chain and the food system, which you'll see in my talk is a gap for me from a professional point of view. So I'm really excited to see what you guys think and some of your thoughts. Much appreciated. So what I thought I'd do, actually, because I think most of us now we're recognizing we're working more in multidisciplinary groups. And so rather than launch straight into just the project that I want to share with you and get your thoughts on, I thought I'd introduce myself a little bit from a disciplinary perspective. I sort of focus on population health and prevention of disease. Thought I'd give a little context to my research, you know, why I'm working in the sort of global context and food systems, and that I focus a little bit more lately on policy evaluation. So just a really brief intro to that. And then talk about the piece of work that I'd really like to share with you, which is around the global food supply and trying to track its alignment with food-based dietary guidelines across different countries and also at the global level. So I just wanted to share some initial results of that work and get your input on that, which would be great. So as Michael sort of mentioned, I've been to the UK and back, but when I started off my career, I'm from the East Coast. I'm from Cape Breton, actually, which is a small island off of Nova Scotia. And I did my undergraduate degree and my master's degree at Dalhousie. My undergrad was in computer science and experimental psychology, of all things. And at the time, I was a research assistant at the Department of Defense, so my research area looked very different. And then I wanted to move into health. So I did at the master's level, go into health promotion and community health and epidemiology. My thesis was more focused on, that's when I started to develop my interest in food. So it was on sort of perceived food environmental factors and diet quality. And then I moved across the pond. I took up my PhD candidacy at the MRC Epidemiology Unit, which is housed at the University of Cambridge. So I stayed there for the course of my PhD, where I focused more on local food environments and health, diet and health. And then also for my postdoc, I stayed there for another couple of years and did more work around policy evaluation, specifically around fiscal evaluation of fiscal policies to use to sort of incentivize industry to change their food products. So in particular, the project I worked on was the soft drinks industry levy in the UK, where the government initiated taxation based on the amount of sugar that soft drinks industry had in their drinks. And then I was part of college. It's a collegiate system at the university, so I was part of different colleges throughout my training. And then I ended up last October back here at York to take up a position in their global health program. So I was really interested in the moving towards a global health perspective and working at the global level. And so it was a perfect opportunity to come back. And I met Michael through our common colleague in the UK. So we'll have to thank Tom as well for our introduction, Michael. So what I thought too is that I'd just give you a little bit of a perspective of where I'm coming from in terms of my disciplinary background, how I think of myself. So I actually think of myself as a population health scientist focused very much on the prevention of disease. And this is the best way I've found to communicate what I mean by that. This is sort of in health, you would very typically have a distribution that would represent, say, risk in a population. So a risk of diabetes, for example. And most preventative efforts in health and public health would be a risk reduction approach, where our job would be to identify people who are at risk of disease, find interventions and mechanisms that we can trigger to either prevent them from moving from a sort of a pre-diabetic state to a diabetic state, or a worsening of their disease, et cetera. And actually how the population approach, if you like, is you have that same distribution of disease, but you're actually interested in shifting the entire distribution. So you don't target high-risk groups necessarily, and you're looking for big changes, typically structural changes, environments or systems, to help move shift the entire distribution for the whole population. And that's called a population approach to disease. So that's how I think of, improving health. And of course, I didn't come up with this notion. So there's sort of a core text, if you like, in Preventative Medicine and Population Health by Jeffrey Rose. And it's in here where he really unpacks preventative medicine from a population perspective. And he acknowledges, I think, things that folks, that work in the field acknowledge for a long time, which is that the things that affect health go well beyond a Department of Health. They're talking environment, employment, education, Social Security, the Treasury, how governments spend money. So that's a really key thing in population health, is that we're realizing health might come to the table as we want to improve health, but the tools we need to understand supply chains, for example, we're going to have to go well beyond health in order to find that. People in engineering and people in mathematics. So that's one example. Another really important concept is that in population health, we're really interested in getting at the causes of the causes, which is how Jeffrey Rose put it. But that's a lot like social determinants of health, commercial determinants of health. So we're really interested in those structural factors that we're going to need in order to reshape environments and systems so that everyone can benefit, or at the very least, we can reduce inequities in those benefits. And then lastly, my own personal take on the sort of global health approach is that, if we want to make improvements in population health, particularly if we're talking about the global context, then we're going to need support of big actors in that system, governments. We're going to need, evidence bases that are really sort of complex and multi-sectoral. And so that, we're going to have to look into industry and how they operate, et cetera. So it's going to be a big complex area, I guess, is the take-home message. And then I thought I'd very briefly just introduce you to some of my past work. So that wasn't at the global level, but it was more around looking at local food availability, diet, and health. And just for an example, we would think about local food environments in different ways. So we would think about it in terms of what sort of food outlets are available to you as a person. So we would collect data on, from surveys that ask information about what people eat and where they live, and other sort of behavioral factors. And we would use geographic information systems to map where they live and along with their own characteristics, and then overlay where food outlets are, et cetera, and look for relationships between those things. Another aspect is, okay, so you've got a certain amount of food available to you in terms of outlets around your home or at your work or during a commute. What about the food you actually eat? What about when you choose an outlet and go in and consume food there? Is that healthy or not? So we did some research around the utilization of particular food outlets, and it's linked to diet quality and weight status, for example. And as you can imagine, unhealthy outlets tend to mean people will consume unhealthy foods, and that's reflected in their overall diet quality. Things like food provision. So once you're in an outlet and there's a certain amount of food available to you, you'll have to make some sort of choice. And then that choice, for example, that you make, we want to make sort of remember that in when you're using dietary intakes as an outcome, there's a food choice, which is you choose a particular food. But what's much more powerful is when that choice happens over and over and over again, every hour of every day, of every week, of every month, you start to develop a dietary pattern. And that dietary pattern can be considered overall of high quality or of low quality. And then hopefully that eventually will link to health status. So this is just sort of an overview of some of the research that was done already around looking at, the availability of food outlets, the use of food outlets, what's available inside, what people choose, and links to sort of an overall diet quality measure and their health status, usually represented as whether or not they were living with obesity, so had a BMI over a certain amount. And then some work that came off of that as well was looking at interventions that might have already tried to shift local food availability. So tried to go in and either use local authority powers to restrict the proliferation of fast food or putting in a supermarket or something like that. So we did some work also to look at interventions. But this was mainly past work that I did in the UK and other places. And what it really did for me was get me more interested in the global level. And I think what I realized is that if you want to change those sort of immediate community environments, you run pretty starkly into much larger systems at work, supply chains and food systems, et cetera. And so I realized that there's a huge gap in my knowledge around the functioning of those kinds of systems. So I got more interested in that. And I also got interested in the fact that actually, if you could tap into some of these things, some of these drivers like food systems, you would be able to probably solve more than one problem at a time. So rather than just focusing on obesity, you might be able to use changes in that system to impact a range of things. And so I came across this description called the global syndemic, which means a synergistic epidemic, which is a bit of a mouthful. But the idea behind it was really interesting to me, which is that it's applying terminology to represent the fact that you can have multiple epidemics that are happening that actually have common drivers. And if you want to try to shift, have maximum impact with the policies or the programs that you're trying to use, then recognizing these big systems and these big interactions is probably helpful. And again, this came from the Lancet publication that came out. They sort of coined the global syndemic, and they highlighted it as a really important challenge that we're all going to face in the 21st century, which is trying to wrap our heads around these sort of common drivers around big global epidemics. So some of the common drivers they talked about in the paper were pointing towards very specific systems as contributing to the global syndemic, as they defined it. And they included food and agriculture in that, transportation, urban design, land use, and they talked in detail about these different systems. And of course, the one that I'm interested in helping to reshape is the food system specifically, and sort of how supply chains might fit within a view of food systems. So we already know that food production is one of the largest contributors to climate change. We already know that current food systems are degrading our environment at a rate that outpaces its ability to repair itself, even if we thought for some reason we could just sort of let things go and they'll work themselves out. We also know in terms from a health perspective that undernutrition, micronutrient deficiencies still affect more than a third of the world's population. And that, if you just do some modeling, you can see that there's enough food produced. It's more of an issue of sort of equitable distribution. So all of these sort of facts that we know that food systems are going to play a role in something like a global syndemic. And it'll be important for us to figure out what we do about that. So the quote that they used in the paper I thought was very nice, which is some of the challenge that we have. And I'm sure a few of you on the call actually would know this a lot better than I would, because you're unpacking supply chains, but they're talking about how the system is more industrialized than it's ever been. It's globalized. It's dominated by really large actors that can work at really large economies of scale. They have really long, complex supply chains. So, you know, you don't have to know too much about the details to realize that it's going to be a big undertaking to try to wrap our hands around food systems and supply chains and how we modify them to better improve health in the environment. So that sort of leads to the work that we've started here at York. Global health at York is relatively new. It's a new area for them to have in the Faculty of Health. They've been developing an undergraduate program for some time, but it was just last year that they formally formed a School of Global Health, and myself and 4 other colleagues, faculty, were hired in to start that school, and we're starting to build it out. A couple of institutes that predated the school by a couple of years is the Global Strategy Labs, that's led by Professor Stephen Hoffman, and the Dada Institute for Global Health Research, that's led by James Orbinski. So all of this sort of collectively is sort of global health at the university that we're starting to get off the ground. And the work that our group does specifically is focused, of course, on food, as I mentioned, and we do this through different kinds of empirical approaches and theoretical approaches. So we rely quite a lot on policy evaluation to give insights of impacts of certain kinds of policies against a range of different outcomes. So we're always looking at different measures or sort of globally relevant measures of systems, that sort of thing. So one of those is what I want to present to you today. Evidence synthesis, we're really interested in theories and method development as well. And we've been looking really closely at systems thinking, complexity science, how and if it can be used in this area to help us improve our understanding of food systems, but also evaluation of changes in those systems. So I'll move into what I wanted to share with you, which is the piece of work on the global food supply. So the alignment between the food supply and food-based dietary guidelines. And I just wanted to give a hat tip to the folks that are working with me on this. So Chloe is a postdoc working with me here at York. She arrived earlier this year. And then Pablo and Catherine and Emily are also supporting this project as well. So I just wanted to say hello to them. So just to introduce you a bit, so the first concept I want to introduce is the concept of food-based dietary guidelines. So these are created by national governments. They've been advocated by the FAO and the WHO since the late 90s. They've done quite a lot of work to try to encourage national level governments to come out with very specific recommendations that are relevant for their populations. And the aim tends to be to support healthy diets to prevent hunger, and particularly in high income countries, to prevent non-communicable disease at the population level. And more recently, there have been a move, particularly driven by the FAO, around how can we ensure that these guidelines reflect not just health, but environmental sustainability as well. Then also we know that not all countries have food-based dietary guidelines, and there can be a lot of variation between them, which makes perfect sense given that they represent different types of dietary patterns across different countries. And there's about 90 countries globally that have developed and published specific guidance. And actually that even predates when the WHO and the FAO started to advocate for this. And the guidance at global level is pretty limited. There's a couple of food group nutrients that different international organizations have come out with guidance around, but it's not sort of widespread or commonly done. And these guidelines, they're broadly similar, but they definitely do have some pretty significant differences, which you would expect. And from a global perspective, just to go back to that for a second, the similar groups at that level are red and processed meat, which there's some guidance from the World Cancer Research Foundation. Sugar and fruits and vegetables, the WHO has sort of internationally relevant guidance on that group and that nutrient. Okay, so we know that, I wanted to make a distinction on this slide. Basically, we know the dietary intakes are often outside of recommended intakes, right? We've known that for quite a long time. And we know that consumption of unhealthy food is has been increasing globally over many years. So I just wanted to distinguish between what people consume and what's available in the supply. So there's tons of research on that already. To support healthy eating, though, at the population level, there's been more calls for structural changes. So essentially having a food supply that supports healthy eating, or, which you could say means supporting the country level guidance that's available in a particular country. So you could use a food supply in a sense to support adherence to guidance if it was aligned in a very similar way. But we don't know a lot about that. We don't know a lot about the alignment between what a country says its population should consume, or what it's sort of recommending for people to consume, and what's available in a supply. And we definitely don't know at the international level. If you look at the food supply as a global phenomenon, if we're aligned with those international recommendations or not. So that drove our question. Our question was pretty basic. It's very descriptive. We're just looking to see what's the trend in the food supply alignment from the data that we have available, 1961 to 2013. We also wanted to look at that by country level income. So the OECD sort of can categorize this country by level of income. So that's what we used for that. So just a quick intro to the data we've used. We've used a descriptive time series analysis, and we developed an indicator of alignment to use that using two data sources. The first is the FAO food balance sheets. So they're available from 1961 to 2013. They tend to represent sort of a comprehensive picture of the food supply available for domestic use in a country. The food groups were constructed based on what's available in that food supply and what sort of country food groups were common across most countries. So we also paired that with the global and country food-based dietary guidelines. There's a repository managed by the FAO where you can go in and find what are the most recent published dietary guidelines of any given country. We translated those into English and extracted what we needed in order to create the food groups recommendation level, which we also did in grams per capita per day. So we had a common metric across the two data sources. Then to create alignment, we just did a very simple, what's in the food supply divided by what the guideline suggests. So a 1 would be, these are quite well aligned. If it's higher than a 1, then there's too much of a particular food as compared to the country level or the international level guidance. And there can be too little. So if it's less than that, then there's not there's not enough food to go around in that food group, for example, in terms of the guidance. So this is some of the results. This is the results for the global recommendations. So fruit and vegetable global recommendations from the WHO, the sugar recommendations from the WHO, the red and processed meat recommendations from the World Cancer Research Fund or Foundation. And this line here represents 1, which would be alignment. And this is, of course, from 1960 to about mid-2010, so 2013 here. And if you look at just what's in the supply versus what the guidance was today, retrospectively, going backwards, adjusting for population as you go, then you get in the terms of fruits and vegetables, you get this, we were quite below what the current day guidance would suggest a population should consume, and then it's increased pretty starkly over that time. So we've focused in public health, and we've focused a lot on fruit and vegetable consumption, I would argue. We've done a lot of work on incentivizing it and improving it and messaging about it, et cetera. And so that's had a bit of an increase if you look at it in every country, regardless if they have their own guidelines, but if you just apply the international level guidelines. Sugar is quite similar, where we actually, there's been a huge increase, but our starting point was actually about where we wish we were now. And then there's been a pretty drastic increase over the decades. And red and processed meat, we were quite a bit below perhaps where there's some of the recommended servings are now, and over time it's made up for that for sure. Then we broke that down by income, income classification for the different countries. And you can see some interesting patterns that you might have been able to guess, which is that in terms of high income countries being red, middle income being green, low income being blue, the red, we tend to be higher consumers in us in high income countries. And the lower and middle income countries kind of started below and have been spending time catching up at sort of different rates. And in terms of sugar, we are vastly above. So that sugar level that we had here, of course, is us. we're driving a lot of that at the moment, but there's some concerning trends down here. You can see where things are on the uptick, which this is dwarfed by the fact that this is quite high. Then red and processed meat is very similar, where we've been higher up and there's been some catch up, and in lower income countries, it's just been quite flat. And then if we look at the country level, so this is now whatever a country's food supply was in relation to what that country also felt their population should consume. We were able to also do it for fish and seafood across those countries, but there's no guidance for that at the international level. So that's why that's new on this slide. It's quite similar. So the fruit and veg consumption has this uptick over time for the countries that have guidelines. And then in sugar, as it's still quite high, and you'll see why on the next slide. It's because this is dominated quite a lot. So for example, it's mostly high income countries that have guidance at the country level for this, for sugar. Then red and processed meat has a very similar, it starts high, it goes higher. And fish and seafood was a bit low and seemed to come up over time. So if we break that down by income again, that you'll see that similar pattern once again, I think, which is that the high income countries are a bit higher, low and middle income countries start a bit lower, except for red and processed meat, which sort of stays around alignment, if you like. And similarly here, high income countries dominate the misalignment, I guess you could say, in the later decades of this food group. Okay, so I wanted to sort of introduce you to those visuals and then give a really brief just interpretation so that we can have a chat about it. One is that I think we all sort of agreed that the main result is just that food supplies are not really well aligned with national and international guidance at the moment. There's been some misalignments, and some of those have really persisted from the beginning. In the terms of high income countries and sugar, for example, we've never been anywhere near close to what the current recommendations are. So it sort of boggles the mind as to what you could do to bring it to that level. I'm hoping we can have a little chat about that. Then there are some notable exceptions to fruit and vegetables seem to come up, and you know, it seemed like bringing food groups up to a level was possible. Reducing them may be more of a challenge. Not sure, but one observation. And then when we stratified by income, I think you can really start to see some of the patterns that are masked by the overall averages, and that, you know, the high income countries are out of alignment to a larger degree on these food groups. And middle income countries have some encouraging trends, and low income countries, but there's some sort of discouraging trends in there as well. There's also an interesting point to be made around fruit and vegetable, fish and seafood. They seem to have some positive trending in terms of, yes, they're getting better over time, and we wanted people to consume more of these foods. That's very much from a public health point of view. It doesn't yet have the sustainability lens put on it around, you know, how much water it takes, or different processing mechanisms or procedures, or so we're not really sure if that's what we want, because we don't have guidance. There's very few countries that have any guidance around sustainability. Most of it at the moment is kind of rhetoric, and not so much embedded into specific recommendations around how much of a food group you should consume because of sustainability concerns. So it'll be interesting to see how that pans out. And then maybe just some final thoughts. It would be around you know, trying to uncover the why behind this, which I think is gonna, you know, we're in desperate need of some of the research I think that you folks are working on, which is unpacking supply chains and trying to, you know, get to know that black box about how the systems actually function from an industry perspective, and how are we going to actually be able to make changes within such massive complex systems. How can governments help with that? How can other sectors help with that? How can the public help with that? You know, what are we going to do about trends like this? It's interesting in this analysis. You can see how long-standing some of them are. And so I imagine it can be quite difficult to shift a food system. Also, the meanings behind this. So this indicator of alignment is very sensitive, of course, to the type of guidance that's put out by a country. So as countries start to adopt more sustainability focused guidelines, then the interpretation of this kind of a metric is going to change. And then also, I just wanted to say that actually we were really, because one of the reasons we did this analysis was partly in its own right, partly because we're looking for system relevant global level indicators that we can use to do policy evaluation, to conduct surveillance, to help monitoring, that kind of work. So we're looking for sort of smart indicators that we can use that might be sensitive to a change that a government might try, or a sector might try, in order to pick up on differences. And then we're looking at stratifying by region and sort of different food production systems. We've been looking into what else we can do with this indicator or metric as well. So thank you. That's it for me. I'm happy to take any questions or have a bit of a discussion. That would be great.
Great. Thank you so much. That was awesome. Let me get my clap emoji. There we go. So I appreciate you giving that talk, and it was really interesting. I think it actually connects some of the things that we've been talking about for the last few weeks, and we can kind of turn it over to the discussion now. Do you mind unsharing your screen? We can kind of see each other here. I might take chair's prerogative and ask the first question. One of the things that I was that struck me was you see the charts that you showed at the end, where the food supply versus the guidelines. Did you all look at the I don't know how to say this, the interaction between the demands or the sort of desires of the high income countries on the supply in the lower income countries? And I'm thinking about Ryan gave a talk a couple weeks back about certain types of foods that basically the crops were transitioned into different types of crops because there was more demand for these other crops in higher income countries, which then was essentially changing the food supply in Guatemala. It was Guatemala, right, Ryan? And so I was curious if you came across how high income countries may drive the food supply market globally across all different income levels.
Right.
In your literature review, or?
Yeah, no, we haven't. I mean, we haven't looked at that specifically, in terms of because I think our primary data source was the food balance sheet, which is sort of balanced for some of that import export stuff. Okay. And it's like what's left over for the population, and then it's weighted by population size. But I think your point, the point underlying that, about what drives the market in these terms of these food groups, just even generally speaking, and how high income countries the actions that high income countries can take can then push changes in a food system in another country. So we don't have in this data yet, we don't have an ability to look at those sort of interdependencies, but I think that would be a really interesting thing to do if it were possible. I don't know how you could systematically do it at the global level, like maybe a case study approach or something. But for example, the evaluation that I was involved in the UK around the soft drinks industry levy, we did some interviews with soft drinks companies, and they were very aware. They were very aware that the market, the sort of soft drinks market in high income countries was on the decline, that they're not in a state of growth in high income countries anymore. And they were developing quite intentionally marketing strategies and efforts to move into markets where they don't exist yet. So just I think you're describing, if I'm understanding correctly, you're describing those sort of interdependencies between different food systems, between countries, particularly high income countries and everyone else.
I think that wasn't exactly the example I was thinking of, but I think that's a really good example. I think I was also thinking about, like, if high income countries have a lot of, let's say they drink a lot of soda, and so there's a lot of corn syrup and sugar produced. And then, that just sort of drives the market there drives demand for those types of crops, which then maybe don't all get used for soda, but they also get used for other types of food. I don't know enough about agricultural production, but
Yeah.
it's a really interesting question. And I'd imagine that it's hard to get data to really show that, but it could be really fascinating to see how that's sort of pushing the market in different directions.
So
Anyway,
I was
go
just
ahead.
gonna, one quick thing, Michael, sorry. I was just gonna say that, and this is probably relevant for Tracy as well, because I've learned that Tracy has an anthropological background, but something that we're really interested to do, and particularly the Chloe who works, postdoc who's with my group, her background's in anthropology, and she's really interested in corporate ethnography and getting in and finding out from an industry perspective. So not just a supply chain perspective, but even an industry actor in this big system. Like, how are they thinking about healthy, sustainable food systems, and what does that mean to them? That sort of is of interest as well. Because I agree with you that we were sort of chatting at the beginning around unpacking this black box that is the system. I think you can use all kinds of methods to do it. This sort of big data approach. I don't know. I wish it were. Maybe someone else can correct me. I feel like it's really hard to do it using sort of big pieces of data, like quantitative data, but if it is possible, I'd love to know.
Let's let other folks chime in. I guess, Tracy, you had your hand up.
Yeah, just a couple comments. Thank you so much. This is a fascinating presentation. And I really wanted to acknowledge how valuable these time series analyses are. And I love the long window, like right from the 60s, in terms of placing a useful lens on government policy, because it's a big ship, slow to move, really tough to steer, and incredibly conservative. And we get very few glimpses into how something like in Canada supply management affects the amount of dairy on the market, or decisions made around foodstuffs like Michael raised about high fructose corn syrup and agricultural production relevant to that. So this allows us that window. So I think you're right, Tara, like some kind of mixed methods approach, but I think this is a really critical key piece of policy analysis, and it's framed in terms that will shift, like that can motivate action at the government level. So I'm really grateful for the work.
Oh, thank you, Trace. That's very kind. Yeah, you expressed it so much better than I could. That was brilliant. Yeah, there's an interest in our group to, because most of us were epidemiologists by training, we're trying to break out of the short timeline window trap that sometimes data forces you into if you want everything at the individual level. And so, yeah, we were very grateful for something like FAOSTAT, like sort of folks in my field sort of look at FAOSTAT food supply data and say, well, it's not what people consume, so we're not really going to know what people are consuming. But yeah, I think your summary of the motivation behind taking this sort of system level data and trying to get the gap that we usually have, which is what is changing over time, a massive period of time. It would be really cool to do, you could pair it with, like, we're trying to do some like policy surveillance as well, like what has changed over those years. I mean, that's a huge piece of work, but yeah, we're an ambitious group. We would love to be able to map on like historical events or big things that have happened during periods of change and shift in that time.
Yeah, I think that would be great. Like, even to take one piece of it, like the fruit and vegetable piece, because that's so critical to recent public health initiatives. But you could take the red meat piece too, and look at transition from pasture to cropland, subsidies, and all sorts of different government levers that have been working on meat industries, and then the industry actors themselves. I think that would be fascinating.
Yeah, a great idea. Thanks.
Other questions?
There's one in the chat, Michael.
Oh.
So Henry asks, based on what you know now, I was wondering if you have any thoughts about the relationship between diet and mental health issues, especially during the COVID pandemic.
That's an interesting question. Yeah, I mean, this is totally out of the side of my mouth, of course, because I don't study mental health as a health issue per se, so I might not, this is more of a first person experience maybe, is that I can imagine, this COVID disruption, I feel like it changed everyone's research agenda. It had to. So any of us that are out sort of investigating how the world works in one way or another, and any data we have, we're gonna have this massive just dip or peak or something, and it's gonna be the pandemic. So I don't think there's any question that the pandemic's gonna impact diet. And food consumption. It's changing, where I get my food and how I get it and how much money I spend on it at different places. And we already know those things shape diet and health. Any link between diet and mental health, I can't imagine. We don't know yet if it's going to be a positive thing or a negative thing. But I think it's fair to say that relationship, there is some research out there that shows the relationship between diet and mental health. So yeah, the COVID pandemic it's definitely going to impact that. There must be folks out there looking at it in a lot of detail. This is the biggest natural experiment to hit probably most of our careers ever. Yeah, good question.
Great, thank you. Excellent question and great answer. Other questions?
Can I ask a question, Michael?
Yeah, go.
So actually I have two questions. One of them is about, it seemed to me that most of the effects that you saw over the time period had to do with the middle income countries, right? Going from a low level to a much higher level. And I'm just wondering how much of that was because those middle income countries actually got richer over that time period, right? And so is money actually underlying a whole lot of the things that you're seeing?
Yeah, what a great question. I would love to, just when we were chatting with Tracy there about how we might be able to go out and investigate, like pull a piece off and look at, overlay some events. Maybe we could find different economic policy that, were implemented in different countries. If we had a decent, if low income countries were the comparator and they didn't have those policies, then that could be really interesting to look at. I suspect, if I had to guess along the lines that the direction you're headed, I think it would be hard to not at least suspect that, sort of if you could create like a prosperity index or something and see if, so maybe not just pure economics, but was there money that came into the country and actually went and did the things it was supposed to, didn't just get gobbled up by corruption or something? Then yeah, perhaps that was what drove that growth. That'd be really interesting too. Yeah.
The other question I wondered about was if you did that same sort of socioeconomic split within a country, so within Canada, do you think you'd expect to see the same patterns, or would it be quite different? I mean, you haven't done the work, so you don't know, I guess, but do you have an intuition as to what that might look like?
Yeah, I think for this in particular, because it's country level, we wouldn't be able to break it down within country, just the nature of the metric. But we definitely already know that there is massive, social and economic patterning of dietary. It doesn't matter what you look at in relation to diet. It's what you purchase, what you consume, what type of outlets you go to, what's around your home. There's massive social and economic patterning on almost every indicator related to dietary intake in terms of its quality and sort of how it might support health. Yeah, so my guess would be absolutely those patterns would likely hold up. Yeah.
Great. Other questions, Ryan?
Yeah. So Tarra, thank you. That was an absolutely fascinating presentation. I really enjoyed that and learned a lot. One thing I was wondering about when I was looking at the different categories of food that you had fresh fruits and vegetables, sugar, red meat, and then seafood as well, right? Why not grains?
Yeah.
And if so, I mean, if you did study, what trends did you see there?
So we didn't do grains. There were some food groups that they either were not common enough across countries so that we could get a decent sample that they could be similar enough where grains was part of their guidance and it was expressed in the guidance in a way that we could quantify. So some, say, low and middle income countries might express in their guidance and say, you should eat some grains, but they don't necessarily like quantify it in a really specific way. So unfortunately, there were some food groups that fell out just because of the nature of the data. Grains was one. And then the other reason that I think that was the reason for grains. The other reason why a food group might not get picked up is if FAOSTAT data is already, I'm not sure if anybody's worked with it, but it's yeah. Oh, perfect. Yeah. So in some food groups, it was just really hard to match what people actually ate with the supply. So in some instances, like fruit and veg, we could get that, and we applied like a cooking correction to it. So with dietary data, intake data, very often you will apply a correction to say, yeah, you might have bought an apple, but you're not going to eat the whole apple. So our estimates are quite conservative in that we've applied the cooking correction and the preparation correction to try to get them close to what a person might be expected to consume. So in some cases, it just seemed like there were some weird foods that maybe had an agricultural role it was hard for us to see that this was for like public consumption of food. I'm actually blanking on an example, but yeah, does that make sense too?
It does. I mean, I guess part of this stems from the line with the red meat consumption. And I'm thinking of how much of that would probably correlate with the increase in grain-fed meat production and industrial meat production for that matter, right? But, I realized the study, that wasn't your project, if you will, but it just got those wheels spinning in my own head there.
Yeah, that's a great point though. Yeah, feel free to follow up with me too if you have, especially, if you know FAOSTAT data and you've got any suggestions. Yeah, we're very
well. I usually just look at it for a very specific Guatemala context, right. but nonetheless, it's very useful database. So thank you. It's fantastic work.
My pleasure.
Tracy?
Is anybody else having little fantasies though about replicating Marianne Nessel's sort of analysis of how dietary guidelines reflect policy and industry relationships over decades? And there was never really a quantitative side to that analysis. It was time series, but really just like this policy was implemented, this was the industry response, and we got these guidelines in the same time period. But that might be interesting to do again using this long window, because there have been a number of iterations that are within that window in Canada and in the US. So that could be kind of cool.
What a great point. That's a mind read. So one of our sources of, what happened over this time period, 100% is that book.
Yeah.
And yeah, it would be, something to do it, particularly on the global level, but even pulling out just like high income country context or something could be really interesting. Yeah, that'd be awesome.
You might get some really counterintuitive results, like at this moment when the market seems flush with dairy, the guidelines, are actually going down for dairy consumption, right? And similar for red meat. So, that describes an interesting set of relationships between industry and policymakers, right?
And two, I should mention that it's not part of this sort of smaller project, but our bigger ambitions in a sense are to start to embed like notions of policy coherence into all of this, which I think is exactly what you're describing. There's, the right hand doing something and the left hand doing something. It was like in the UK, there were, taxes around sugar sweetened beverages coming out while they were what's that word?
Liberalizing? I guess now I can't say it.
I was like, liberalizing, that doesn't sound right. Liberalizing the sugar at like the cap in the EU as well. So they were opening it up while they were also trying to restrict it, which just doesn't make any policy sense. Yeah. Great point.
Cool. Another question in the chat here. One second. Henry asks, how will new innovations like 3D printing of vegan steak affect food policy evaluation worldwide?
Oh, interesting. God. I mean, it won't, will it affect evaluation? It'll affect food policy, I imagine. Once we find out what it is, will people consume it? Does it, it'll depend on, there's all kinds of questions you could ask about the impact of printing meat or meat-like substances. You know, there's questions of health, there's questions of ethics, like, you know, is this what we should be doing so that there's less animal-based proteins out there and processing? And yeah, but Henry, are you like doing a PhD or something maybe? Or are you a faculty member with a research program that might take on that question? I don't know of other new innovations as well. I know at York there's quite a lot of interest in, and not just at York, actually, it was in the UK as well. There was a lot of interest in innovating our way to healthy, sustainable, equitable food systems, rather than, so some of us are more about, you know, introducing regulation and, you know, getting industry to come along and that sort of approach. But then there's a whole load of folks that feel like we just need the right technology that's going to get us out of this mess. I have one perspective on it, which I feel kind of like we're going to probably have to do the hard work, social and political work. Yeah, it would be interesting to know if we can innovate our way out of this. Yeah. Oh, there, you are doing a PhD. Great. Be a cool PhD topic.
Great. Any final questions? We got a couple minutes left. No? Well, I think I will end up calling it. I've been on Zoom calls since 8 a.m., so I'm I'm ready to close my eyes for a bit. I really appreciate you taking the time. That was a really fascinating talk and a great conversation. And I think we'll have to be in touch as we sort of develop our research agenda here at U of T, because you guys are just down the road, up north, as I like to say. And so I'm sure that there's a lot of potential collaboration that we could look at. So again, thank you for your time and a great talk, and we'll hope to keep the conversation going.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It was a pleasure. And thanks so much for the great ideas and perspectives and chat and discussion afterwards. It was, yeah, really helpful. Can't wait to keep in touch. It'd be great.
Great, great. All right, and I owe you drafts on other things too, so I'll get that to you eventually.
No worries, no worries. Okay, Michael.
Bye.